My name is Ulinka Rublack and I'm a historian interested in Renaissance dress. One of the details I noted that are really new in the 16th century are feather headdresses. So they're worn by men as much as women, and whereas in the 15th century you get an occasional feather that is attached to a hat, suddenly they're much more elaborate headdresses and many more feather makers who turn out to be a specialized craft. The feathers obviously demand a lot of skill to be worked with, and that was what we investigated, but I wanted to go further. And so I cooperated with Jenny Tiramani, the head director of the School of Historical Dress, and wanted her to reconstruct the feather headdress worn by Matthäus Schwarz, an accountant of the Fugger merchant company in Augsburg in the 16th century, who left us this extraordinary sartorial autobiography. 136 images record what he looked like, and we focused on a feather headdress he's commissioned for 1521, where he meets Ferdinand of Austria, the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who's just been elected in Germany.
Think about the 4 C's as the 4 elements of dress, and the 4 C's in this case, they, as always, are the content, the materials and other parts it's made from, the cut, the shape, which I've just touched on a bit, saying I think it's in the round, I think the feathers go all the way round, the construction, so what is the structure basically, and then how is it put together, and the context, which is obviously given to us as a gift by his book of clothes, because we have the date, the 10th of May 1521 is when he tells us he wore this outfit, and that's a marvellous thing to know and a very rare thing to know.
So Matthäus Schwarz had first really encountered the habit of wearing ostrich feathers when he was in Milan and training as accountant, and Francis I, the King of France, came and conquered the city, and Francis really made everyone who counted for anything wear a new style of beret with ostrich feathers, and we can see that in Matthäus Schwarz's costume book, that he adopted this look as well in heraldic colors, so the colors of France, blue and yellow. So when Ferdinand of Austria enters Augsburg, it's clear he's going to be very influential. He's got close dealings with the Fugger company, who give him large credits, and Matthäus Schwarz is involved in that. And Schwarz can also hope to gain some personal favor from that relationship. So these were sort of high-vis clothing that he invested in, and also very much to honor Ferdinand I. So it's the heraldic colors of Austria in this case, the white and red he's wearing over his helmet.
What we have on the table here is we have a piece, just a piece of felt that was made for us by Rachel Frost, who is a felt maker and a hat maker, and Rachel used a natural sheep's fleece that she prepared and made this felt, which is fairly substantial. It's about, I'd say it's about a 1/16 of an inch thick, and she stiffened this with gelatin, with an animal glue, and it's got a lovely stiffness to it, which it will hopefully hold. This is picture number 48 in his book of clothes, and interestingly, in image 46, which is only, I think, about 2 weeks before, well, the 10th of May is when he's wearing the feathered bonnet. The 24th of April, he's depicted wearing a very, very similar split brim bonnet. Yeah, this is literally like 2.5 weeks beforehand. So it is a very good guess that this could be the same bonnet. And whereas the one in 48 is not described in detail, here in his caption to the picture, he tells us that the bonnet is with atlas, which is the term he uses a lot. Atlas silk is usually satin, where the floating threads give you this wonderful sheen and shine that really no other textile does. So we know there's satin here, and he says velvet. In the period, these textiles are extremely, extremely important. I think, you know, it's the money that was spent on something like this bonnet. Most of it, I imagine, was spent on the materials, not on the labour that made the bonnet.
So I've been part for the last 2 years of a Swiss National Foundation from the project on materialized identities, where we asked that question: how did objects interrelate with the way in which people felt about each other, and how were they tied to new ecologies, new cultural meanings that were generated in this period? So we wanted to know what skills exactly did it take to actually manufacture this? What would it have looked like? This had never been done before. What was it like to work with ostrich feathers? How would they have moved? How might they have made a man like Matthäus Schwarz feel when he moved? And what kind of visibility did it give to him?
Featherwork is a very secretive trade. And still it is still today, and you could say it's one of the trades that's sadly dying out a little bit, because it's been, because of its, if you like, secrecy around it. And it's a delicate trade that just results in something almost magical, where you can't really see the work that's gone into it. Ostrich feathers start off as, you know, quite a slightly messy thing on an ostrich with little brown bits, and usually, you know, they needed to be processed, bleached and then dyed in a way that retained their fluffiness, the fluffiness of each single filament that makes up the feather that comes off the spine. The use of feathers, particularly ostrich feathers, seems to grow in the 16th century.
1521 was such a signal year also, because that is the year when Charles V brings over the extraordinary feather headdresses and feather clothing from the Americas that have been collected by Cortés. So Charles V gifts these to his sister, to other people who matter, so does Cortés. And an artist like Dürer saw these in Brussels in that same year, in 1521, and was absolutely amazed about the artistry involved. So we can see here that through the interest in the Americas, but also through the interest in the Ottoman Empire, and all these people who've really cultivated the feather arts, as we now think of them, there's a real change in the perception of them as adornment. This is now really prized by those who are fashion leaders like Matthäus Schwarz as a subtle craft. And we can see through the way they had to be worked with, and just what an ostrich feather looked like, why that notion of subtlety and ingenuity suggested itself so much.
The first inventories which record the featherwork and the feathered artifacts that Cortés sent to the Spanish king, to the Spanish court, and to the church highlight the striking colors of green, blue, yellow, orange and scarlet feathers. And Cortés himself emphasized the notion of material treasures from the Aztec empires in the letters that he sent to the Spanish king. Charles V, for instance, he stated that gold, jewelry and feathers appear in their natural perfection in a nowhere else seen splendor.
It's cut on a circle. We know that the majority of the cutting was based on geometry, obviously using concentric circles just here. And the circle was divided into 9 shapes for the front and 9 for the back. And then we cut these out of felt and then stitch them together. You have the spangles just here, working up the inside of the spine of the feathers. You can probably see them more clearly on the red. And they are worked in a metal thread, which is called a filet thread, and the spangles are worked individually onto the threads and then twisted and then stitched on down the spine of each feather. And again, it's about sumptuousness. It's about showing off the detail by just decorating everything.
So in the history of material culture, I think it's absolutely essential to integrate the reconstruction for pieces that are very clearly historically contextualized, such as this feather headdress worn by Schwarz. These are experiments. It's not about doing things absolutely authentically, but getting a sense of the skill that was used and getting a sense of what kind of visuality this would have created. It leads us into the period eye and the period senses. I had no idea before I saw this recreation just of the kind of space this would have taken up and commanded of itself, and just of the way it created movement in space and how many hours of labor would have gone into creating a piece of this kind. And that tells us just how important it was for men like Schwarz to invest in, how integral it was to their own sense of making a statement about themselves, positioning themselves socially, but also enjoying this new subtle craft.
We've got basically two completely different elements here put together. So this, we keep calling it amongst ourselves here at the school, we call this the feather crown. It's a crown of feathers, and it is an entirely separate piece to the bonnet, which it's almost like a hatband over the bonnet. So I'm going to separate them in a minute to show you both separately. And we have attached the ostrich feathers to a minimal wire frame. You know, using wire frames at this period in the 1520s, we know was popular and useful to hat makers and milliners of all sorts, because it gives you a very strong lightweight structure. So obviously you don't want heavy things on the head if you can help it. You know, you want to keep the weight down, and you know, more is more, so you want as many feathers on your head for something like this as possible. The scale of this not only shows how many feathers he's paid for, you know, and long feathers too, because short feathers, you know, obviously, you know, you can actually get quite a lot out of cutting feathers up. So there's a lot of, you know, wealth and status involved in what he's showing, as well as the symbolism. But also, you know, in the situation on the open field where he wore this, you'd be able to spot him half a mile away, because there wouldn't be anybody wearing an identical headdress. Especially a multi-layered ostrich feather like the one in my hand, or these, it is to the touch one of the most sensuous kind of experiences. It's got no kind of substance to it. They weigh nothing, and they're very, very soft. But the other thing, and why I think traditionally through, you know, maybe the late 19th century and into the 20th century, they've been so important for burlesque performers and strippers, is the movement is absolutely, you could say, titillating. There's no depiction in the Book of Clothes of Matthäus Schwarz wearing this bonnet or this style of bonnet with a feather crown without armour on. It's shown with feathers only with armour, but we made the feather crown separate or on a wire base, so that we could imagine that it was a bonnet he already had that perhaps was adapted for use on the field. And so here it is without its attachments, if you like. There we go. You can see it works. It works on its own as well. Want to turn round? Just walk a little. Lovely. Great. Great.
So what's interesting is that the custom of wearing feathers becomes feminized only later in the 17th century. But up to then, men in the military, but also civilian use, were very much in love with feathers and exploring all different combinations of feathers, different dyes in feathers. It was really an integral part of their clothing ensembles, which hasn't really been highlighted by historians of dress in its significance.
This is the bonnet with the feather crown. We're showing it with a helmet, which, strictly speaking, this helmet is a bit later in the 16th century, but we hope it gives the right impression of this bonnet that we think might have been worn several weeks earlier by Matthäus, with streetwear, with his ordinary, his clothing, without armour. But obviously, I think in those couple of weeks, if it was the same bonnet that's described as being of red silk satin and silk velvet, then it would have been probably firmly fixed to a helmet specifically, whereas we've sort of put the two together for you to see the effect of the crown of feathers and the bonnet and a helmet, but we wouldn't say that this is a trio that originally went together in this fashion. So we've kind of balanced it and we've made it give the impression, but it's not very fixed. However, I think we would like Jack to try to move around just so that you can see the kind of three-dimensional space that this kind of headgear gives him, which really increases a person's the spectacle a person creates and a person's prominence in a landscape. So Jack, slowly, maybe you could just walk a couple of steps, turn round gently.
What we learn from this then is that a feather barret already had great significance in this period, and that it was rather instrumental to how social competition was played out in these performances and displays. And this helped Matthäus Schwarz. In the end, the visual strategy worked out, and he was ennobled by Ferdinand and became part of the aristocracy.